Okay, good. So a male interpreter had showed up instead of a female interpreter, which is what I had preferred. And it was actually someone that I knew and that I was friends with. At that point, I had to be sure to separate the interpreting situation from our friendship outside of interpreting. It can be easier for me if I don't know who the interpreter is in situations like this because I'll be more open with my questions and maybe more specific because we don't have our relationship together. You know, also sometimes in medical situations you're required to undress. And I don't want to feel like a male is judging me or kind of examining my body. I don't really want them to look at me. Those situations can tend to be sticky. But it is also interpreting, and I need them, so I need to disengage because I need to be able to see them sign, and they need to be able to speak for the medical staff. So for this experience that I had, I was going for an ultrasound to check on my baby. I walked in with my wife, and the technician had informed us that we had lost the baby. So that was a friend of mine, and I do feel like, you know, no matter what, despite our friendship and our great connection, I mean, I love him, but I think he's always kind of going to be scarred, and whenever he sees me, I feel like he's going to relate that interpreting job to what I had experienced. It also goes with the interpreter that was at the funeral for my father. He had also passed away, and I kind of can't really see him interpret yet because I also do the same thing. I kind of connect that interpreter with that situation. So I know that we'll still have a connection in the future, but for now I kind of need to keep that on hold.
It's important for the interpreter to remain confidentiality. They shouldn't be going around discussing any situation in which they've interpreted. Your breasts are perfect. Sometimes doctors are uninformed about deaf individuals. For example, my first mammogram, I was extremely nervous about it, and my family has had a history of breast-related illnesses. I had an interpreter. I assumed it would have been a woman. Went in. We were in the waiting room, and they had called my name. So into the examining room, and the nurse informed the interpreter that she needed to leave, that it was against the law for her to be in the room at the time. I was slightly concerned. How was I going to communicate with the nurse? During the examination, the nurse was speaking to me, and I informed her that I was deaf, but she just gave me a thumbs up and continued. And the exam was completed without an interpreter present. So as soon as it was finished, I started bawling my eyes out. I had blown up at the interpreter, saying that, why weren't you in the room? I needed you there. She told me that the nurse said she couldn't be in the room at the time. I told her she needed to advocate for the deaf, not just accept anything that medical staff tell her. So I had to return for a follow-up examination the next day because they had found something. And I made a point to say that the interpreter needs to be there with me. It's non-negotiable. They were concerned because I had been undressed, and that's a sticky situation, but we cleared it up and made sure that I was covered, but that I could still see her hands, and she was still able to voice for me. It's important as interpreters to advocate for the deaf. It's important to also explain the situation because sometimes medical staff aren't aware of procedures that go along with being an interpreter and using one. It's also crucial as interpreters to make sure you're aware of yourself and how you're feeling, whether that be you're thirsty, hungry, not feeling so well. It's important to make sure the presenter is aware so you're not inhibiting the deaf presenter. You can inform them that you need a break, take 5 minutes, recuperate, cover, and come back ready.
And sometimes the interpreter and the deaf person or the people involved can have equal benefits. Do you know that sign? All right, I'll share a little story. I'll give you an example.
My friend Diane and I traveled to Cuba. She was my interpreter for about 2 weeks. I made sure to tell her that if she needed a break, it was totally fine and to just let me know. She doesn't speak any Spanish, but I can read and write Spanish, so we made do. Most people in Cuba speak Spanish.
But I knew that she didn't understand it, so if she missed any words or didn't understand anything, it was totally okay.
So, for example, when it's a group of Black individuals speaking with one another, the way they communicate, the style tends to be different than, I don't know, it's more comfortable, open, and they can speak more freely with one another. But when it's a predominantly white group with a Black individual, there's more refinement in the way they speak with one another. One example is there was a group of, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 people. It's Diane, myself, and a young Black woman. We were just talking, and Diane had picked a specific word when voicing for me, and the young woman wanted to know her reasoning behind choosing that word, and Diane informed her that it was mediating between the two, that the way I would speak with her needed to be matched and facilitated. So she picked an appropriate word that I would use. Whether or not she had been there, it would have been the same. Another example is like the hearing and deaf community. So in a predominantly deaf group of people, they speak more bluntly and
more straightforward. We're just very casual when we talk. We understand each other because a lot of us have the same experiences. But in the hearing culture, the language is a little different. You have to be sure that as an interpreter, you can pick a word that you're comfortable with and that you're comfortable with in a certain situation.
if you're not comfortable, it's important to let the deaf person know, because then they can make choices in the future whether or not to call upon you for that specific job. Also, if you show up to an interpreting job upset, angry, disoriented, anything along those lines, it's important to take a minute and settle yourself. Make sure that you're ready and focused on the interpretation, and then return.